I'm pleased to be here with Sin Senh, the President, CEO, and Principal Hydrogeologist for Roux Associates. Pleasure to have you, Sin.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. So Roux started primarily in the environmental and management services consulting space, but has expanded both in terms of services and geography in a variety of ways. Tell us a little bit about Roux, its history, what you do, what you're most proud of.
Sure. Roux started by Paul Roux back in 1981. As you said, traditionally was a environmental consulting firm that worked on large, complex Superfund projects. And over the years, we evolved and added services like real estate and litigation and insurance. And today we're doing environmental consulting still as a core business. We also do human health consulting, economic consulting, ecological, data solutions, and occupational health and safety. And so it all stems from the core of the environmental business, but it has evolved into a more diversified services for our evolving clients.
Great. And you've got a pretty significant geographic footprint. Last count, 7 states. Different parts of the country. So there's that geographical diversity as well.
Yeah, and that's more of a relatively recent thing in our 40-plus year history. In 2011, we expanded from our core Northeast offices, which were, New York, Chicago, Boston, and the Philly area. And now we're out in California, we're down in Texas, Virginia, and we've got some states like New York and California. We have multiple offices just to service our clients.
Great. We want to dig in a little bit more with Roux a little bit later in the interview, but I want to start with your youth. You've had an extraordinary journey to your current role. You came to this country as a boy, not knowing a word of English. Tell me about that journey and how it's shaped your leadership.
Sure. I come from a pretty large family relative to American families. If you think about the Brady Bunch being a big family, I'm one of 9 kids, and grew up in rural China. And my father passed away when I was very young, and my mother decided that being a very patriarchal society, this wasn't going to be the environment that she could sustain her life in with her kids. And so somewhere around 1981, she packed up her stuff and, took myself and a few of my siblings. At the time, I was 7 years old and journeyed across communist China's waters to try to get into what at the time was, Hong Kong, British rule Commonwealth, pre-1997. So this was back in 1981. And, I would say that where, I am today without her making that journey, and I will talk a little bit about her journey itself and what we went through. That sacrifice she made really helped shape me and the way I run the business and manage the folks here. But the short story of it is 1981. We crossed the borders, and I remember sitting at the bow of this little junk boat and thinking 7 o'clock in the morning they were lighting fireworks, and turns out they were gunshots. So it was the border patrol shooting at the boat, and my sister took a bullet in her hand, and my mom took 3 bullets in her stomach. And so when we finally made it across the border, and there were several other people on the boat that were shot and were killed at the point. And because my mother was in critical condition, the British ruled government took her in, and then placed myself, my brother, and one of my sisters in essentially an internment camp. And we assumed she had passed away, and we were just kind of left as orphans. We were there for 9 months, and one of our relatives that were in the United States, outside of Seattle, Washington, basically got a Presbyterian church family to help sponsor us. And we were, right before we left Hong Kong, we were reunited with my mother. So came to the United States in 1982 through a sponsorship program through a church. And, we didn't have a penny in our pockets and didn't speak the language. So, growing up the first few months in Seattle, Washington, in 1982 was precarious, to say the least, not
Sure,
understanding
sure.
what folks, were saying. From there, the journey migrated to Missouri and then to the Bronx in 1984. And so I spent most of my youth in the Bronx, and until I went to college in upstate New York in Binghamton, and graduated from Binghamton with my undergrad and master's degree in hydrogeology. Started Roux in June 1st of 1999. It's the first and only sort of professional job I've had since I graduated college, and I started out as a field geologist, like anyone else who would just, have recently graduated from college, and I worked myself through the ranks over the years, from managing the corporate office to expansion of our geography in 2011, and became the CEO of the firm in January of 2020. And then 2 months later, had to work with the pandemic. So, and here we are, almost 5 years later. It seems like an eternity ago.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the quick run of my story.
Sure.
But there's
And
a lot more details I can go into.
oh, sure. And you lived in you were in a tough neighborhood. You were in the South Bronx, and you've shared a lot of stories about navigating a part of the world that's a really tough neighborhood. And you've had some mentors along the way, a teacher who really made a big impact, and we'll return to that in a little bit. Thanks for sharing that story. It's an extraordinary one, and one that's very inspirational. I know that you've shared that with in a variety of audiences, and including your company, and it's quite a story. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I have. I mean, it was when I was about to step into the role, I was going to write my story up, and it was very long. I think I had over 6 pages of text, and decided that I was going to share my story. But the pandemic hit, and a couple of years ago, I decided, looking back at surviving the pandemic as the new CEO, and looking what we accomplished, I thought it was worthwhile to share. And so I've kind of created a tradition since 2020 of my telling my story, or portions of my story, every Thanksgiving time, as a way to kind of give back and give thanks, and let people know that this isn't just a bunch of corporate folks that are running the organization. It's I was one of them basically for many years, and so grew up in the company.
No, the first time you did that with your firm, I felt very privileged that you shared it with me. And even though I knew the story, reading what you shared with your company, it took my breath away. It was an extraordinary moment. And thank you for sharing that. Let's turn to Roux. One of your primary goals as CEO is to grow the next generation of leaders for the firm. Tell me why that's important, the challenges and the opportunities.
Sure. Grow up the company. I mean, we've always been preached to, and now I do the preaching of our number one core value as a business, which is to stay privately held. And in an increasing industry where private equity, venture capitalists, and mergers and acquisitions are all occurring at a very fast pace, we believe that our long-term success really will rest on our ability to heed the words of our core value, or number one core value, staying privately held, and that means we've got to make sure that we have the people here that are willing and able to take on the leadership and ownership transition of the organization, and that we're staying highly profitable to make sure that happens on the financial side. And so, for me, it means more than the sort of profits and dollar side of the business. It's a legacy that Paul Roux has, made us aware, in many discussions about. That's what he would like. He said in 1998 that 50 years past his death, he would like to know that there's a shingle with the name Roux on it. And sort of from that conversation, we developed this strategic vision of staying privately held. We developed this strategic vision of growing the next generation. And, they have had, as a family, the Roux family and the founders and the majority ownership of the firm have had many opportunities to evaluate the selling of the company and evaluate how much money they can make, and it's just not important to them. And as a result, for what they have been so generous in taking care of the people of the company, I just see myself as a puppet of that core value, making sure that everybody follows suit when we look at staying privately held and making sure that we're still here, right, in 50 years, 100 years, with the notion that we're passing on the ownership and leadership transition to the next generation.
Sure. And you're a critical link in that chain. You're the first you're the second non-family CEO. And that can be a difficult transition from founder-led, family-led to outside the family. You've talked about why it's important. What are some of the challenges and opportunities with growing the next generation?
For one, I mean, post-pandemic, we saw a lot of challenges in just, the sort of society issues with talent acquisition, or talent wars, right? I mean, the war on talent, the Great Resignation, we dealt with all those things. And so sort of in the immediate recent history, that was a big challenge. But historically, just we don't have I would say the ability or the historic knowledge of running a business where you're looking at growing the next generation as a primary goal. Most of our hires, close to probably 85 to 90% of our hires are all technical folks, engineers, geologists, biologists, scientists. And so, I would say to most folks that are kind of not in the business, I went to school to lick rocks. I didn't go to school to run a business. And so learning that aspect of managing a company, leading a company is still, I want to say, relatively new to us because for the most part, we don't really have business people running the business. We have scientists running the business.
Yes.
And that becomes its challenge of, not whether it's not knowing or not understanding some of the more business type decisions. We manage with our emotions, we manage and lead with our hearts, and that can be troublesome, right? Sometimes when you look at something like the pandemic where, we just refuse, right, no matter what the financials look like, to lay off or furlough anyone.
And in fact, you hired people and promoted people during that time.
We did. And, and it served us well post-pandemic, but, when you're down in the weeds dealing with the pandemic, that can be a daunting task, right? Because most businesses, the right decision from a business standpoint would have been to lay off and furlough and terminate people.
Sure. Yeah, and we've talked about the fact that most of the people you hire are technical, and another factor is you're a highly entrepreneurial firm. These are technical people with a book of business, seeking to grow that book of business, and you're consultants, a firm of consultants. And that strikes me as, and we've talked about this, another one of the challenges that the people, you've got fabulous people, they're fabulous technically, fabulous entrepreneurially, those are tremendous assets, and they can be limitations, right, in taking a different perspective of really stepping back for the long term, not just the next consulting engagement, but the next generation of engagement. A lot of challenges there. What led you, thanks for sharing that, Sin, what led you to join Vistage?
When my predecessor as CEO, who was here for 33 or 34 years, retired, the plan was always for him to retire in 2020, sometime in the middle of 2020. And, I found myself alone during the pandemic. I found myself in a position where I was very unknowing or not knowing of what the future would hold. And you had reached out to me, I think, via LinkedIn, and I, actually politely declined, said no thanks, and thought about some more. And I think it was, I know it was, the first conversation you and I had, which was, well, why are you doing this, Jeff? You were an executive, you were a CEO, you were retired, and the notion of helping people and helping leaders, become better was something that I was like, let me give it a shot, and that's what I did. And I believe my first conversation with you was, I'm giving you my 90-day notice now, right?
I was 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago.
Right, almost 3 years ago this August, I said that, and so I believe that it takes the right chair, and it takes the right chemistry between the chair and its members for folks like myself to really not only stay, but enjoy every chance we get to spend time together.
Sure. No, and that's very mutual. Talk about the value you've gained from Vistage.
I think the biggest value I've seen in the last, 2+ years is, the members and yourself as a chair in these meetings um, challenge me in ways that I didn't think I needed to be challenged. And I think the word that comes to my mind most often when I think about Visage is it challenges me and makes me vulnerable. I've broken down a few times about certain issues that that are happening in the firm that I just frankly don't have anyone to turn to within the organization, and that sort of makes sense. Being the CEO of the organization, you can't really let your guard down and let folks in to help with some of these issues. And so I think the vulnerability really I want to say attracts me to the group. Look forward to like I can't spend enough time with them. Even after the meetings, we're getting together and having a drink or having meals, and I think that value of having a group of people that understands what you're going through, but aren't technically in your seat because we're not in the same industry. But very similar challenges, whether it's a service-oriented industry or a the manufacturing industry, or some of the members are consultants as well.
Right. Yeah, and that vulnerability theme, you've been extraordinarily open, which takes a lot of courage, and with that, the trust within the group is really enhanced. And one of the things I appreciate very much about working with you is that you're articulating what so many others are feeling but not speaking. And it takes courage to do that, and I continue to appreciate that about your leadership, Sin.
Thank you. And also I want to add to the fact that the vulnerability piece, also has changed and helped me become a better father to my kids. Understanding some of the challenges that they go through, being sort of teenagers, I see a lot of similarities in the way their mindsets are with the younger folks at Roux. I also, saw their sort of evolution or, going through COVID, as teenagers.
Yes.
And I think that translates well to having conversations with some of the younger folks at Roux who, went through college their first few years during COVID.
Yes.
And not that I understand completely, but at least having an understanding that their growth in organization will be different. I don't know how different, but they will be different than the way I grew up or the way others have grown up in the last
Sure.
10 or 15 years.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think the group has really helped me with understanding some of the communication barriers and some of the sort of mental health and emotional component that, historically I never really understood or dealt with it, right?
Right. Right.
Given my childhood and upbringing, it was always worrying about, I always tell my kids when they were younger, like, look, when you're worried about putting food in your belly and food on the table on a regular basis, you don't have time to have emotions,
Right.
right? You put that, you suppress that down and you just bury it and you go get the job done. And that's what I've done most of my life.
Sure. Sure. Let's stick with the group with one more question. How would you describe the culture of our group?
I think the support with each other has been the biggest factor for me. Even when members either take a break or leave, I often ask you and others, like, what happened to that person? What happened? We're curious. And I think that curiosity comes from the fact that, I've learned to care for some of these people, understand their business, understand their challenges. But I think the biggest piece of our group is that support that we give each other, both in and outside the meetings. And I think that, if someday, for whatever reason, some of us are not part of Vistage anymore, I'm pretty confident we'll still remain friends.
Yes.
And that's a big factor in the group dynamics.
Sure. Yeah. Sin, what has been the impact of Vistage on your own leadership, both personally and professionally?
On the professional side, I mean, I have definitely made decisions because of the feedback and the value I get out of my Vistage meetings. So, for example, historically, we really didn't look at acquisitions of another firm as something that we would ever do. It was always described, internally here for decades as acquisition was a lazy man's way to grow.
And many people laughed when they heard you. You saw that they're anything but easy, right? As you learned.
And we made our first true acquisition with a location up in Buffalo for about 27 technical heads and about 30 people total. And we're still going through the integration and onboarding process almost a year later, and definitely not as easy as I thought it would be. But I look back at that decision and had the effects both on the sort of professional financial side of the organization, but more along the lines of adding more good people to the organization and helping it grow, not for the sake of growing or to be bigger, but to be better and to better service our clients.
Yeah,
I look at that and said, we would never have evaluated that if that didn't come up as an opportunity, and I processed the issue within the Vistage group first.
Yeah, and that's a great example of a way that I've seen you change. And there's a variety of others where you've looked at things differently, you've approached decision making a little bit differently, you've approached interacting in general in a little different manner because of the perspectives that you've received from the growth from the group, and your openness to learning, which is so important to Vistage. I think you've been particularly exemplary on that front. Let's close where we began. We started with your journey coming to this country as a young boy in a very, very hazardous journey. And there were people along the way, most especially a teacher when you were in school in the Bronx, and then a sponsor family where you've been impacted by the kindness and goodness and commitment of others. And you often talk about the importance to you of giving back and paying it forward. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, first, let me give nods to the two people that you're talking about. The first is May Pendergrass. She passed away a few years ago before COVID. I'll give an example of the generosity of the family. I actually wrote about this past November, which I can share with you if you like. But I remember growing up for the 2+ years in Seattle, to these Americans who brought us to the country in this gigantic mansion and rich household with waterfalls and gardens. And my sister actually got married there, one of my sisters, Tracy, and so she still lives in Seattle. That was, 1982, 1983, and then parts of 84. When I got married in 2001 to my wife, Christine, who we went to Binghamton together. We honeymooned in Alaska, and we ended our journey with Vancouver back to Seattle. And then I wanted to introduce her and bring her to the Pendergrasses' home. And so I borrowed my sister's car, and we drove up to the house. And, I didn't recognize the house because it was so small. It was a small little ranch, but the same 1978 Ford, Granada, white Ford Granada was still in the driveway.
Wow.
And we walk in, and, this place was small, dingy, dark, very cluttered. And it was not what I remembered it to be. And it just turned out that these were actually poor people. Having, exposure to people with actually money, I realized that when I was a child, I didn't know what I didn't know, and I had to have a comparison to. And so the point of the story I want to get to is when we left the household, and there were many interactions, for the hour plus that we were there. My wife, who plays piano, noticed they had a Steinway, which, I know how much Steinways can be. And so she was like, "Oh my God, you guys have a Steinway." And it was donated to them many years ago. So my wife walks up to the piano, and it wasn't the Steinway that caught her eye. It was, the 14 photos that were sitting on top of the piano. And one of the photos was, my mother, my brother, my sister, and I in 1982 when we first came to the country. But there were, at least 13 other families. And I read in her obituary years later that, they had sponsored over 300 plus people, Southeast Asians. And so, for people who didn't have much of any means and financially, Because we had just gotten married and we were on a honeymoon on the way back, and she comes out of the room and hands me a $10 check, and I'm going, I can't take $10 from this woman, But my wife said, if you don't cash this $10, it's going to break her heart. So, for people who didn't have much to give so much,
yes,
was the start of it. And I didn't really understand that until I finished college and started my career here at Roux. And another gentleman, Leonard Plastino, who was my 7th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade math teacher. This was a teacher who followed a group of students from elementary school to the middle school because he enjoyed them so much, and working with them. And his goal in life was really to teach us culture and give us exposure. And so here's a guy from Orange County who drove an hour plus every single day for years to teach a bunch of inner city kids about culture outside of the regular math class. And he introduced us to what I at the time knew was the Managed Education Center, but which is a facility that's run by Christadora. Christadora is a 125-year-old plus settlement house, but a nonprofit that its only mission is to provide sort of environmental education and leadership training to inner city kids in New York City, sort of underprivileged and poor kids. And I was one of these many kids, and Mr. Plastino or Leonard, brought us to this organization. I went up there for two nights and basically an overnighter up in North Adams, Massachusetts. I fell in love with it, and I asked, how do you get back? And I ended up going back for 3 straight years in the summer for 3 weeks each. And I sold it to my mom at the time was for $30. They were gonna basically let me live up there and 3 square meals a day, and I didn't have to work for it. It seemed like a win-win for everyone. But at the Managed Education Center and through Christadora is where I really learned about the environment, created and learned about the sort of the support for environmental sustainability, education. We're at a couple 100-acre facility that's in the Berkshire Mountains, and you're learning how to camp, you're learning how to canoe and backpack, and I just fell in love with the outdoors and learned so much. And so when I went to Binghamton for my undergrad, I majored initially in environmental studies, and then dual major with geology, and then ultimately focused on more the geology side. I graduated college, came here at Roux, and lost touch with Christadora. I never knew that Christadora was sort of the parent organization. I just did the Managed Education Center. And during COVID, late one night, I found them basically on the website, and I reached out to them, and they reached out back. And in 2021, was invited to become a board member of Christadora, which I decided to join. I'm still part of the organization. And in fact, just 2 weekends ago, led a geology walk in the Fort Tryon Park up in the Inwood area of Manhattan.
Yeah.
To a group of students. And so, Christadora really has helped me shape the professional that I am today. And so I look at it in simplest forms as without Christadora, I wouldn't be at Roux. And now that I'm at Roux and I can give back, I give back as much as I can. So I'm part of several committees, and it's not just a financial, contribution, but it's my time. I spend a lot of time, as much time as I can. It balances me out a little bit, even when I'm super busy, to work with the students and help with the outdoor educators, and work with the programming folks that.
Yeah, thank you, Sin. That's such a wonderful story, and it bespeaks the impact of both the woman who sponsored your family and the teacher who impacted you. Yeah. And I appreciate so much your appreciation and gratitude for that, and how you're applying that by paying it forward and giving it back to others. Sin Senh, President, CEO, Principal Hydrogeologist at Roux Associates. Thank you so much, Sin.
Thanks, Jeff.